What if the biggest financial disasters in history were never accidents, but predictable stages in a repeating pattern that has been unfolding for more than a century? What if the same hidden architecture that powered Charles Ponzi in 1920, Enron in 2001, and Bernie Madoff in 2008 is now shaping the trajectory of an entire global superpower? And what if China, right now, is not approaching danger but already standing inside stage 4 of the same 7-stage fraud cycle that always ends the same way, no matter how large the system grows? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are necessary if we want to understand the true mechanics behind financial collapses: institutional deception, manipulated balance sheets, and the economic illusions that drive nations toward crisis. The pattern is clearer than most people realize. Every major fraud begins with credibility, expands through engineered confidence, attracts capital through perceived stability, and then distorts reality to maintain appearances. It happened with Ponzi promising impossible returns. It happened with Enron fabricating earnings through mark-to-market fantasies. It happened with Madoff, who built an empire of lies through trust and reputation. And now, when we examine China's shadow banking network, its local government financing vehicles, its overstated growth projections, and the opacity surrounding its corporate debt, we see the same underlying structure repeating at scale. Not a corporate scheme, but a national-level system built on leverage, concealment, and unsustainable expansion. Each of these financial disasters began long before the public noticed anything was wrong. The danger is always invisible in the early stages, hidden beneath smooth numbers and confident speeches. But stage 4 is different. Stage 4 is where the internal pressure becomes impossible to hide. It is the moment when inconsistencies multiply, when data no longer aligns, when liquidity dries up behind the scenes, and when authorities work desperately to maintain the illusion of control. That is precisely where China stands now, caught in a cycle where debt must expand to prevent collapse, where losses are masked, and where confidence must be manufactured faster than reality deteriorates. And this is why understanding the true meaning of stage 4 is essential. Because once a system reaches this phase, the next steps are not random. They follow a historical logic that repeats itself across centuries, across continents, and across every major fraud. Before we go deeper, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever experienced a situation where everything looked stable on the surface, but you could sense the cracks forming underneath? If this topic is opening your eyes, leave a comment, hit the like button, and check if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next, because what you discover in the next stage may change how you see the global financial system forever. If you look beneath the surface of every major financial collapse, you will find the same invisible foundation holding the entire structure together long before it breaks. This hidden architecture is what creates the 7-stage fraud pattern, and it always begins with the same subtle ingredients. At first, there is a promise, usually wrapped in the language of opportunity, growth, or national strength. It sounds rational. It feels safe. It reassures investors, banks, politicians, and ordinary citizens that the system is stable because it has worked before. This early stage is not built on lies, but on selective truth, and that is what makes it so dangerously effective. No fraud begins as an obvious fraud. It starts as a clever distortion of reality, a shift in incentives, a compromise that seems harmless but quietly changes the rules of the game. Once this early foundation is laid, a more powerful force takes over: the normalization of manipulation. Numbers become tools of persuasion, rather than reflections of economic reality. Accounting choices turn into strategies. Risk models become marketing. Growth projections morph into political weapons. Ponzi used promised returns. Enron used complex financial vehicles no one questioned. Madoff used reputation to bypass scrutiny. In each case, legitimacy became the shield that allowed distortion to grow in the dark. And this is exactly how countries fall into the same trap. When an economy depends on maintaining an illusion of uninterrupted strength, data stops being information and becomes a narrative, selectively adjusted to protect confidence at all costs. At this stage, the system becomes increasingly dependent on perception. Investors trust the numbers not because the numbers are solid, but because they appear consistent with the story they want to believe. Governments rely on credit expansion because slowing down would reveal structural weaknesses. Households and corporations behave as if growth is guaranteed, building decisions on optimism rather than fundamentals. This is where the fraud pattern begins gaining momentum, even though almost no one recognizes it. The danger is not in a single false number or misleading report. The real danger lies in how the system starts rewarding those who present the most optimistic picture, punishing anyone who questions it, and quietly suppressing dissenting voices that might expose the truth too early. This silent shift marks the true origin of the pattern, the transformation of the system from a reflection of economic reality into a performance designed to maintain confidence. That performance becomes addictive, because every institution inside it benefits in the short term. But like every cycle before it, the structure becomes increasingly fragile. And once this dynamic takes root, the next stage becomes inevitable, not because people intend to deceive, but because the system now requires it to survive. As the pattern advances, the system enters a phase where the incentives become stronger than the safeguards, and the pressure to maintain appearances exceeds the pressure to tell the truth. This is the stage where manipulation shifts from subtle adjustments to structural engineering, where debt stops being a tool and becomes the core mechanism holding everything together. In every major historical fraud, this moment is unmistakable. It is when the system begins relying on borrowed credibility, borrowed money, and borrowed time. Ponzi expanded payouts through new deposits. Enron fueled its valuation through off-balance sheet entities. Madoff kept his empire alive through constant inflows that masked the absence of real performance. And at the national level, economies replicate this same behavior by using leverage to smooth volatility, conceal weaknesses, and delay the recognition of losses that would otherwise be unavoidable. Once this cycle begins, the internal logic becomes self-reinforcing. If revealing the truth would trigger a crisis, then concealing the truth becomes the only acceptable option. Governments roll over debts instead of confronting them. Banks refinance loans that should be written off. Corporations stretch accounting assumptions to avoid reporting declines. Statistical agencies revise methodologies to make growth appear steadier. This does not happen through conspiracy, but through institutional survival. Each actor inside the system believes they are buying time, stabilizing markets, or protecting confidence, even as these actions compound the fragility beneath the surface. The desire to maintain stability becomes the very force that accelerates instability. This is also the stage where the system becomes mathematically dependent on expansion. Debt must rise because growth is overstated. Spending must increase because previous commitments cannot shrink without exposing weakness. Asset prices must be supported because their collapse would reveal how little real value exists behind them. What began as a temporary adjustment becomes a permanent condition. And because no one wants to be the first to acknowledge the imbalance, everyone participates in the performance. Credit rating agencies maintain optimistic outlooks. Banks agree to extend maturities. Regulators accept opaque disclosures. Politicians defend the narrative as if national pride depends on it. But beneath this coordinated silence, a dangerous transformation is happening. Losses accumulate out of sight. Risks migrate from transparent areas of the economy into darker corners where oversight is limited. Parallel financial systems emerge to hide leverage rather than reduce it. And as the structure grows more complex, fewer people actually understand how it works. The illusion of stability becomes both thicker and more fragile, because complexity hides risk until complexity magnifies it. History shows that once a system reaches this point, the next stage is not defined by the truth slowly emerging. It is defined by the moment when the truth can no longer be contained, and the pressure behind the illusion begins to exceed the system's capacity to absorb it. As the fraud pattern matures, the system enters a dangerous phase, where small distortions evolve into structural weaknesses, and those weaknesses begin to reinforce one another. This is the moment when anomalies multiply, when inconsistencies in financial reports become too frequent to ignore, and when the pressure to keep the entire Structure standing forces institutions to adopt increasingly aggressive tactics. In the first stages, manipulations are optional. In stage 4, they become mandatory. The system now depends on concealing losses, smoothing volatility, inflating valuations, and maintaining the illusion of stability at any cost. What once was a choice becomes a necessity. And this shift marks the turning point where the pattern accelerates toward outcomes that can no longer be reversed. At this stage, markets stop reacting to fundamentals and begin reacting to narratives. Confidence replaces cash flows. Assumptions replace earnings. Headlines replace balance sheets. Institutions discover that the simplest way to prevent panic is to control the story, not the numbers. So the story is managed, quarter after quarter, report after report, until perception drifts so far from reality that the gap itself becomes a systemic risk. This exact dynamic played out in the build-up to Enron's implosion, where creative accounting became indistinguishable from operational performance, and in Madoff's case, where consistency became a red flag only after it was too late. Now imagine this same mechanism, not inside a corporation, but inside an entire nation, where data revisions, hidden liabilities, off-balance sheet structures, and shadow financing collectively redefine what stability means. The silent danger of stage 4 is that the system still appears functional on the outside. There are no spectacular failures, yet. Institutions continue operating. Markets remain active. Leaders insist that everything is under control. This illusion creates complacency, even as the internal pressure reaches critical levels. It is during this phase that incentives become fully misaligned. Officials fear acknowledging reality because doing so would expose years of concealed fragility. Banks fear marking assets accurately because the resulting losses would cascade through the system. Local governments fear tightening budgets because growth targets must be met at any cost. The result is a synchronized effort to defer, disguise, and delay the recognition of truth. What makes this stage so dangerous is that every attempt to maintain stability deepens the instability that follows. When growth slows, credit expands. When assets weaken, valuations are propped up. When liquidity tightens, guarantees multiply. These short-term fixes accumulate into long-term vulnerabilities, pushing the system into a state where any shock, even a small one, can trigger a chain reaction. This is the inflection point where fraud is no longer the act of individuals, but the behavior of the system itself, sustained by collective incentives that no single institution can afford to reject. And once this feedback loop forms, the path to the next stage begins unfolding on its own. If you have ever seen a situation where the appearance of strength hid a deeper fragility that everyone tried to ignore, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective can help illuminate how these patterns repeat across different systems and different moments in history. Once a system becomes dependent on distortion to sustain itself, it begins to replicate the same behavioral patterns that destroyed the great corporate frauds of the past. What makes this stage so revealing is that it exposes the universal mechanics behind collapse, whether it occurs in a small investment fund, a multinational corporation, or an entire national economy. At this point, the system no longer operates on genuine productivity or transparent accounting. It operates on momentum, on the belief that past performance guarantees future stability, and on the assumption that confidence can be engineered indefinitely. This is the stage where economies begin repeating the same logic that fueled Ponzi's impossible returns, Enron's fabricated profits, and Madoff's flawless consistency, all while convincing themselves that their scale makes them immune to the same fate. The illusion deepens because the stakeholders inside the system are rewarded for maintaining it. Politicians gain credit for growth that is borrowed rather than earned. Banks earn fees for expanding credit that will never be repaid under normal economic conditions. Corporations benefit from inflated demand created by easy financing rather than sustainable fundamentals. Even households become part of the cycle, relying on rising asset prices, cheap loans, and a sense of security, derived from numbers that no longer reflect real economic health. This interconnected dependence creates a self-reinforcing ecosystem where everyone has something to lose if the truth emerges. And so, the truth stays buried a little longer. In this phase, the system begins to experience a form of internal inertia. Each institution looks outward and sees that everyone else appears confident, so they behave confidently as well. Regulators hesitate to intervene because intervention could destabilize markets. Creditors roll over loans because marking them down would reveal losses. Local governments continue spending because stopping would expose deep structural gaps. The entire system becomes a synchronized performance, one that grows more elaborate as the underlying reality deteriorates. This same inertia drove Enron executives to escalate their deception until the entire structure collapsed under its own weight. The most dangerous part of this stage is the belief that scale equals safety. Enron believed it was too innovative to fail. Madoff believed he was too respected to be questioned. Nations falling into this pattern believe they are too large, too powerful, or too strategically important to collapse. But history shows that size does not protect a fragile system. It amplifies the consequences. The bigger the structure, the more catastrophic the fallout when the illusion finally breaks. And as the system grows more complex, the pressure to maintain the performance becomes overwhelming, pushing it closer to the point where the internal contradictions can no longer be contained. This is the point where the fraud pattern starts shifting from a controlled illusion into an unavoidable crisis trajectory, setting the stage for the next phase, where signals of deterioration stop being theoretical and begin manifesting in ways too significant to hide. Stage 4 marks the point where internal contradictions start rising to the surface, but Stage 6 is where those contradictions begin shaping the visible world in ways that cannot be fully disguised. It is the moment when the system's hidden weaknesses, once buried behind accounting maneuvers and manufactured confidence, begin influencing real economic behavior. This stage does not announce itself with a dramatic collapse. Instead, it unfolds through subtle but unmistakable signals that accumulate into a pattern too consistent to ignore. Liquidity begins tightening in unexpected corners of the financial system. Credit becomes harder to roll over, even for borrowers who once had limitless access. Projects slow, repayments slip, forecasts shift incrementally downward, and reassurance multiplies faster than evidence. These are the early structural tremors of Stage 6, the phase where the pressure behind the illusion becomes more powerful than the illusion itself. What makes this stage so important is that the system still looks functional from the outside. Growth might continue, but with more volatility. Banks might remain operational, but with rising exposure to opaque liabilities. Companies might report profits, but with increasing reliance on adjustments, revaluations, and optimistic assumptions. The facade remains intact, but every month requires more intervention to keep it standing. This is where the gap between reported data and lived reality begins widening. In past fraud cycles, this played out through earnings restatements and sudden liquidity shortfalls. At the national level, the same tension emerges through sudden credit contractions, unexplained financial freezes, or government programs created to prevent sectors from buckling under accumulated strain. The defining feature of this stage is institutional hypersensitivity. Minor problems trigger disproportionate responses because the system has lost its natural resilience. Small shocks that would once have been absorbed easily now require coordination across banks, state entities, and regulators. Emergency lending facilities appear not because of crisis, but to prevent a crisis. Official narratives emphasize stability even more aggressively, precisely because stability has become harder to maintain. And as this dynamic intensifies, the system starts revealing which parts were dependent on artificial support. Real estate becomes a source of stress. Local governments face shortfalls. Corporate defaults appear in industries once considered safe. These signals are not isolated failures. They are symptoms of a system reaching the next phase of the pattern. Stage 6 is also where time becomes the enemy. The longer the system delays recognizing losses, the larger those losses become. The more liquidity is injected, the more dependent markets become on intervention. The more confidence must be engineered, the less confidence actually exists. This self-reinforcing cycle accelerates the system toward the point where the internal pressure must be confronted. And even though collapse has not yet begun, the trajectory is now unmistakable. The structure is still standing, but the ground beneath it has begun to shift, setting the stage for the moment when the accumulated weight of hidden risk transitions into consequences that can no longer be postponed. As the system moves deeper into the pattern, the escalation of risk becomes impossible to ignore. Stage 7 is where fraud shifts from isolated distortions to a fully systemic phenomenon, spreading through institutions, markets, and government structures like a slow-moving contagion. What once were individual weaknesses now become interconnected vulnerabilities, each one amplifying the others. This is the point where the system's internal logic turns predatory, feeding on its own credibility to postpone the inevitable. In corporate collapses, this is the moment when emergency loans are sought behind closed doors, when auditors begin asking sharper questions, and when insiders quietly prepare exits. At the national level, the stage unfolds through tightening liquidity, rising defaults, conflicting data, and sudden policy shifts designed not to strengthen the system, but to prevent its immediate unraveling. What makes this escalation uniquely dangerous is the migration of risk from transparent sectors into shadow structures. The more the official system strains under pressure, the more activity shifts into areas where oversight is weak, reporting is inconsistent, and accountability is minimal. Debt is repackaged, losses are moved off balance sheets, new financing channels appear to replace old ones that can no longer function. This creates a hidden network of obligations that grows more complex with each attempt to stabilize the visible economy. In past corporate scandals, these shadow mechanisms took the form of off-book partnerships or undisclosed liabilities. At the scale of a nation, it manifests through opaque financial vehicles, implicit guarantees, and a labyrinth of institutions designed to absorb risk without revealing it. This is also the stage where government and market incentives become indistinguishable. Officials fear allowing failures because failures would spread. Banks fear admitting losses because the losses would cascade. Corporations fear reducing output because doing so would reveal the artificial nature of demand. Every actor becomes trapped inside a cycle where the only acceptable response is further escalation. And with each new layer of intervention, the system becomes both more stable in appearance and more fragile in reality. The performance must continue, not because anyone believes the numbers, but because stopping the performance would expose how deeply compromised the structure has become. In this phase, instability becomes self-perpetuating. A small failure requires a rescue. The rescue increases hidden liabilities. Those liabilities reduce future flexibility. Reduced flexibility increases the likelihood of another failure. This feedback loop accelerates as the system expands interventions faster than it expands real productivity. And while the surface may still appear calm, the underlying tension grows thicker, heavier, more volatile. History shows that once a system reaches this point, it no longer needs a major shock to lose control. A minor disturbance, a local default, a sudden policy shift, even a single failed auction can be enough to trigger a chain reaction that exposes everything the system has spent years trying to conceal. If you have ever witnessed a situation where risks spread quietly beneath the surface, until everything felt connected, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective adds insight into how these patterns grow long before they break. As the system advances, the signals that once appeared subtle begin forming a consistent pattern across multiple layers of the economy. Stage 8 is where macroeconomic indicators, political incentives, and structural imbalances start aligning in a way that reveals the broader trajectory. This stage does not emerge through a single dramatic event. Instead, it takes shape through a mosaic of pressures that, when viewed together, expose the direction in which the system is quietly moving. Growth figures become increasingly difficult to reconcile with underlying activity. Debt expands faster than output. Credit conditions tighten even as official statements insist on stability. Behind the scenes, policymakers begin shifting strategies, implementing measures that hint at the scale of vulnerability they are trying to contain. In this phase, the divergence between public narrative and internal reality grows wider. Governments assert that fundamentals remain strong, yet liquidity injections become more frequent. Regulators emphasize resilience, yet new lending tools and emergency backstops appear with increasing regularity. Corporations report stable revenues, while their cash flows tell a different story. Investors maintain cautious optimism, but capital begins gravitating towards safer assets or foreign markets. These contradictions are not accidents. They are symptoms of a system that has exhausted its natural buffers and is now relying on intervention to maintain balance. One of the clearest indicators of this stage is the emergence of debt opacity on a national scale. Obligations begin stacking across layers of institutions, municipalities borrowing to meet growth targets, state-owned enterprises refinancing old liabilities with new ones, banks rolling over loans that should otherwise be written down. This accumulation does not happen transparently. Instead, it is distributed across shadow entities, joint ventures, special financing platforms, and mechanisms designed specifically to obscure the scale of exposure. The result is a structure that appears orderly on the outside but is held together by a web of obligations too intricate for anyone to fully map. At the same time, political incentives start to work against structural reform. Acknowledging losses would undermine credibility. Reducing leverage would slow growth. Tightening regulations would expose how dependent major sectors have become on artificial stimulus. And so, the system chooses inertia over adjustment. This is not unique to any one country. It is a pattern observed in every major financial collapse. When underlying fundamentals weaken, political systems often double down on the very behaviors that created the instability in the first place. Another defining feature of this stage is the silent withdrawal of confidence from insiders long before the public notices anything wrong. Capital outflows increase. Wealthy actors diversify quietly. Institutions hedge more aggressively. These behaviors do not create panic, but they signal that those closest to the system no longer trust its long-term stability. In past cycles, this was visible in executive resignations, liquidation of personal holdings, or sudden strategic pivots. At the national level, it appears through unconventional policy maneuvers, unusual financial flows, or increasingly defensive economic positioning. By the time all these signals align, the system is already deep into the historical pattern that precedes the final stages of correction. The surface may still appear controlled, but the underlying dynamics reveal a structure preparing for consequences that can no longer be deferred. By the time a system reaches this stage, the question is no longer whether the pattern applies, but how far along it has progressed. And when we examine China through the lens of historical financial collapses, the parallels become strikingly clear. The same warning signs that preceded Ponzi's downfall, Enron's implosion, and Madoff's unraveling are now emerging across China's economic landscape, not in isolated pockets, but across multiple layers of its financial architecture. The fragmentation between official data and observable activity, the rise of hidden liabilities, the tightening of liquidity beneath the surface, and the relentless need to sustain confidence through narrative rather than fundamentals all point to a nation deeply embedded in stage 4 of the fraud pattern, with several indicators already bleeding into later stages. To understand the magnitude of this pattern, one must look beyond headline growth figures and examine the structural weaknesses forming beneath them. China's property market, once the engine of national expansion, now shows characteristics eerily similar to corporate structures that collapsed under the weight of overstated valuations and understated risks. Developers reliant on perpetual refinancing mirror the logic of Ponzi-style cycles, where new capital must continuously replace old obligations. Local governments depend on land sales and off-balance sheet borrowing to meet growth expectations, replicating the same structural concealment that allowed Enron to maintain its facade long after its real financial condition deteriorated. Shadow banking channels, once celebrated for flexibility and innovation, now function as the scaffolding holding together sectors that would otherwise be forced to confront massive losses. These structures resemble the hidden pathways Madoff relied on to maintain returns that never existed. Every rollover, every extension, and every implicit guarantee becomes part of a complex web designed to postpone recognition of reality. And while these mechanisms succeed, for a time, they also deepen the vulnerability of the system, because each intervention increases the magnitude of adjustment required when the cycle eventually resets. The tight control over information further contributes to this dynamic. In past corporate frauds, transparency was the first casualty. Executives defended their performance even as internal documents showed the opposite. Whistleblowers were ignored or silenced. Questions were dismissed as misunderstandings or attacks. At the national level, this manifests through data revisions, abrupt methodological changes, and narratives that emphasize stability despite growing indicators of internal stress. The more carefully controlled the message becomes, the more pressure builds behind the scenes, accelerating the pattern rather than interrupting it. Foreign investment patterns also reveal the same shift seen in previous collapses. Capital inflows slow, withdrawals increase, and multinational corporations begin reassessing long-term commitments. These adjustments may appear modest at first, but historically they signal that sophisticated actors recognize the widening gap between perception and reality. In the collapses of Ponzi, Enron, and Madoff, early quiet exits were the clearest sign that the internal structure had become unsustainable. China now shows similar movements: discrete capital outflows, defensive reserve strategies, and increased reliance on domestic investors to fill gaps once supported by global confidence. Taken together, these indicators paint a picture not of an economy approaching instability, but of one already deeply entangled in a historical pattern that has repeated across centuries and across every major financial deception. The risk is not theoretical. It is structural, cumulative, and accelerating beneath the surface, setting the stage for the final evolution of the cycle. When a system reaches the final stage of the pattern, what emerges is not a sudden explosion, but the slow realization that the structure has exhausted every internal mechanism for postponing reality. This is the phase where the accumulated weight of years of concealed losses, overstated growth, hidden liabilities, and manufactured confidence begins pressing against the limits of what intervention can contain. Historically, this moment has always carried the same quiet intensity. You can feel the system tightening, even if nothing visibly breaks. Markets behave oddly. Liquidity moves in strange patterns. Institutions shift strategies with unusual caution, and the most telling sign of all is that reassurance becomes more frequent than evidence. That repeated need to affirm stability is the clearest indication that stability is slipping. In national economies, this stage reveals itself through a kind of structural fatigue. Each new stimulus produces less impact than the one before it. Each policy adjustment buys less time. Each attempt to restore confidence requires a larger, more coordinated effort. The economy begins to feel heavy, like it is carrying more than it can realistically support. This is not collapse, but the precursor to it, the moment where internal contradictions have grown larger than any single institution can manage. Debt can no longer expand fast enough to mask losses. Shadow structures begin straining under their own complexity. Even the most carefully shaped narrative starts to feel thin around the edges. What makes this stage so revealing is the way ordinary indicators become unreliable. Growth that once surged with stimulus now barely responds. Credit that once flowed freely now moves hesitantly. Asset prices, once buoyed by confidence, begin showing erratic behavior. Foreign capital becomes more cautious, domestic investors more defensive. This is the same behavioral shift observed before every major correction in history. When the pattern reaches its final phase, the system behaves as though it knows something its participants have not yet fully admitted: that the conditions sustaining it are no longer reproducible. The trajectory beyond this point has always been shaped by the same underlying mechanics. When a system becomes too dependent on illusion, the eventual confrontation with reality is not optional, it is structural. That does not mean chaos is inevitable, but it means the forces shaping the future are no longer the same ones that shaped the past. The corrections that follow are not simply financial, they are institutional, political, and psychological. And the impact spreads far beyond the initial point of failure, touching markets, households, governments, and global relationships in ways that ripple forward for years. The final stage is not the end of the pattern. It is the moment the system begins redefining itself through consequences that were postponed for too long. If you reach this point and feel that this entire pattern gave you a new way of seeing how financial crises actually form, beneath the surface, Leave a comment saying something like, "I'm here until the end," so I know you absorbed the full journey. If the insights made sense and opened your perspective, hit the like button and consider subscribing so you stay connected with this kind of deep, structured analysis. And if you want to continue expanding this understanding, there is another video right here that complements everything we explored. Click and keep going. The connection we built here continues there in a natural progression.